So I looked at this little bottle and I thought, I wonder who Anne Page was. Well, it turns out Anne Page isn't a person. Who knew that this little bottle had such a fascinating story? Okay, I'm going to give away the ending now. Anne Page is just a brand name used by A&P grocery stores. One question we will answer today is, how did grocery stores go from being a small shop in town to being supermarkets? Believe it or not, A&P bridges this gap, and we owe our current shopping experience to this company. This is a fun one, so let's get into it on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. I read an interesting article about the changes to the grocery business. I linked it below if you are interested in reading it for yourself. So we know back 120 years ago, the average grocery store was mostly local mom and pop shops carrying only necessities. The local shop owners would have known most of their customers by name and invested time in knowing about their families. Regardless of the occupation, photographer, shoe repair, you name it, it was most likely a small local shop that provided that service. If you needed baked goods, you go to the bakery in town. Milks, cheeses, you would go to the dairy farmer. Sodas, liquors, you would go to the appropriate shop. A&P started out specializing in tea. The story begins with a guy named Nathaniel Gilman. He was born in 1778. Nathaniel comes from an ancestor on the Mayflower. His family were shipping merchants ever since, and they owned ships between New England and every port in the world. It says they were a long-lived, money-making family. They were largely engaged in the tanning business, Nathaniel owning no less than a dozen large tanneries. In 1850, at age 71, Nathaniel has a house full. It doesn't specify what relation everyone is to him, but he had 6 kids with his first wife, and when she died, he had 4 more kids with his second wife. Anyways, Nathaniel is listed as a merchant here, obviously. George is listed here as working with his dad, and at some point they branched out into teas. Here's 2 ads in 1847 for Nathaniel's leather. When Nathaniel died in 1859 at age 81, he left his family very wealthy. He was estimated to be worth about $1 million, and in 1859, that's an insane amount of money. His family members continued to run the business, which apparently by this time had multiple branches, including one in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, I'm not sure how many family members are involved, but I know that at least 2 of his sons, George and Winthrop, are involved. George was born in 1826. Now this poor guy looks miserable. Look at that permanent frown and bags under his eyes. I'm not gonna lie, he looks kinda mean. I don't know, maybe he just doesn't feel well that day, or maybe he's just really stressed. He kinda looks like he's in the middle of an argument with the photographer. So over at the St. Louis branch, there's a guy named George Hartford, and he begins working as a clerk there, and he works his way up into management. He was really good at promotion and advertising. Now he looks a lot more agreeable. Now I see a few stories that give Hartford the sole credit for being the founder of the company, but that's just not true. So at some point it looks like George ends up taking over the tea part of the company while Winthrop took over the leather concern. George Hartford ends up moving to New York and working on the teas with George. 2 Georges. Yeah, that's not going to be confusing at all. So during this video, I'm going to set their pictures next to their documents so we can avoid confusion. Their store was at VC Street in New York City, which brings me to this building on this corner. There's a 100-year anniversary article that recounts the history of the business, and although I found discrepancies with this story, it still has some interesting details, so I'll be peppering them in throughout the story. This says that the VC Street store was a wonder to behold. Outside, a huge gas-lit T illuminated the storefront of, quote, real Chinese vermilion and flaked gold. Inside, the red and gold scheme carried over to huge tea bins that lined the walls. Japanese lanterns cast a bright hue over the cashier's cage, which was in the shape of a Chinese pagoda. A brass band played on Saturday nights. It says that they were considered spectacular even in the era when P.T. Barnum was in the height of his glory. By 1869, 10 years after opening its doors, the location had been outgrown and it moved to a nearby location. At this time, they added coffee, which would later be called 8 O'Clock brand. It says Wells Fargo wagons were delivering coffees and teas throughout the land. It was also this year, 1869, that they changed the name of the company to the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Now, maybe George Hartford is considered a founder because he was there when this company was renamed. It was 8 Church Street, which brings me here. Soon, they had a chemist who was beginning to manufacture baking soda in the back of the store at a fraction of the cost it took to buy it. Now, this began the idea, hey, we can make our own stuff for much cheaper. They kept with the red and gold theme for their newest store locations and their wagons. It says there was a vast fleet of traveling stores. The driver of the wagon wore many hats, as he was a salesman, a clerk, a cashier, a blacksmith, and a vet to handle the wagons and the horses. The first time we see them pop up in the papers is 1870, still sticking to the Chinese theme, I'm supposing because they were selling Chinese tea. By this time, George Gilman is 40, and he doesn't seem to have any children with his wife Ellen. George Hartford, on the other hand, is 36, married, and 3 small children. George Hartford's sons started working there when they got old enough. Little George and Little John jumped right in and learned the business. Here in 1877, we are in litigation over Nathaniel's fortune, even though it's been 18 years since he died. For some reason, Nathaniel put 5 executors to the will, and none of them can agree on anything. One of them being from his second set of children, Anna. In this case, she was not cooperating or agreeing on the terms that were finally agreed upon with the other 4. She single-handedly drug out the process because she felt that her mother, the second wife, wasn't fairly compensated. In the 18 years that this has taken, no one was really handling the mansion properly, and it was now deteriorated to the point of almost worthlessness. The more time they're wasting on this, the less their inheritance is worth, so they're trying to finalize it. I never understood, though, the greediness that people get when people die. This says, over the coffin in which lay the unburied body of the dead man, the quarreling began which culminated Friday in the affray between 3 sons, in which a pistol was drawn and 2 heads were broken. What the heck does that even mean? Moving on. 1885, Winthrop dies of pneumonia. It has some interesting details in here about Winthrop, saying upon his death, not even his kids knew how much land he owned or how much wealth he had. He never talked about business with anyone, not even close confidants. Apparently, he owned thousands of acres of land for lumber in various areas. In 1882, look how many locations are listed here. I count 26 locations here in New York City for the tea company. 1888, this says that regarding the Nathaniel estate, Anna and George are basically the biggest opposing contestants during this ordeal. It says Anna has paid out about $35,000 in lawyer's fees at this point and is probably indebted to the estate. They're looking into whether that is the case. 1890, I'll be honest, I didn't read all this, but it looks like various members of the family are ordered to court to discuss Winthrop's estate. By 1900, our guys are getting up there in age. George Hartford is 67, and 2 of his 5 children are living at home, including George Jr., who's now 32. But in 1901, George Gilman dies at age 75. His wife had died 6 years ago, and they had no children. He's reported to be worth $40 million. It says he had 285 stores, and he had each one of them send him a $1 bill every day. I just did that calculation. Just $1 a day, 285 stores times 365 days would be over $104,000, on top of everything else that made him money. This one says he practically lived as a hermit. The only person who saw him on a regular basis was his barber, who came to shave him daily. It says he received a big annual salary. And, just like clockwork, about a week later, the family is fighting over his estate. And that's pretty much the end of the Gilman story as far as we're concerned. So at this time, George Hartford takes over the business with his sons. A couple years later, in 1904, I see two of the sons listed here, Edward and George Jr., along with their dad. I'm not sure why John is missing. I think it's because he might be in New York and not here in the New Jersey directory. This article says that it was John who, in 1912, thought of running a discount-type store, stripping away all the bells and whistles to sell food over the counter for cash, as opposed to delivery services. He says so much money could be saved if they came to him that customers wouldn't mind forgoing the extras. So around the corner from their main outlet, he opened up such a store. It ended up becoming the biggest moneymaker in the chain. He even went so far as foregoing a sign out front. It turned out he didn't need one. Within 6 months, his nameless outlet was the most profitable shop, and A&P around the corner had been run out of business. Running with this idea, they decided, what if we offered a one-stop shopping experience? Instead of multiple shops to the butcher for meat, grocers for produce, farmers for milk, what if they were all under one roof? The 1920s saw this into reality. It was called the combination store. Multiple stores were organized in places like New York, Boston, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Jacksonville. Here's a 1922 A&P ad in the paper. So George Hartford died about a week before his 84th birthday in 1917, and one of his sons, Edward, dies a couple years later in 1920 at the age of 52. So John and George Jr. have a pretty good handle on the business at this point. The late 30s birthed the supermarket. By 1936, there were 20 supermarkets. This proved to be very popular, and more popped up steadily, and at the point of this article in 1959, it says most of the retail outlets are of the supermarket variety. It says one of the reasons why A&P was able to stay on the forefront for so long is that the company was always changing with the times, and it adapted to the needs of the customers. When refrigerated railroad cars started to roll out, A&P were one of the first food chains to utilize it, to distribute California oranges, Texas grapefruit, Georgia peaches, and fresh seafood to the average family. When customers started complaining about the bottleneck at the meat counter, they developed a system of pre-packaging the meats. I'm going to be honest here, growing up in an age where this was just always how it was, this was blowing my mind that this is why we have pre-packaged meats today. Wow. So here's another radical idea. Why not just buy the bakeries to bake the goods for them? Dairy plants and canning plants, and A&P would run them all. Before this, the way it worked was these places would sell to wholesalers, who would then take the extra trouble to sell to individual shops. And to make sure that everyone gets their cut, prices would be higher to the customer. Now, with A&P cutting out that middleman, this was a huge money saver, which in turn made the items on their shelf cheaper than their competitors. But their competitors were, of course, the mom and pop shops. So that's not good for them. 1930s also saw the birth of Women's Day magazine, created by A&P. It started out as a free in-store menu recipe planner. Its main target was to make customers buy more by giving them meal ideas. A&P fully owned the subsidiary called the Stores Publishing Company. So the magazine morphed into a 5-cent magazine on childcare, crafts, cooking, gardening, and decorating. 94 years later, it's still published today. Ann Page was a name brand A&P manufactured, and I thought, oh, that makes sense, A&P. But they had other brands like Jane Parker and 8 O'Clock Coffee. In the 40s, A&P was actually capturing 10% of all grocery shopping in the U.S. 1949, the government started cracking down on A&P for monopolistic practices. This article is showing the many housewives and merchants that are fighting for A&P in this suit, because if the government makes A&P split into multiple chains, the prices will go up. So John was president, with George Jr. serving as chairman until 1951, when John died at the age of 79. He actually had a heart attack on the elevator on the 56th floor of the Chrysler building. Apparently he was a director at the Chrysler Corporation. It says by 1935, A&P had more than 15,000 stores. But after the supermarket took hold, the smaller stores consolidated to about 4,700 stores now. John had married twice. He divorced his wife, married briefly to the second wife, and then he remarried his first wife. He had no children. This says he made headlines in 1945 when John said he loaned Elliott Roosevelt, who was the son of the president, about $200,000, and finally settled the debt for $4,000. The 1950s, I found lots of Life magazine ads, complete with really interesting recipes. By 1956, we see a guy named Ralph Burger as president, 2 vice presidents, and George Jr. is still hanging in there as treasurer. Now, George Jr. dies the following year in 1957 at age 92. This says that he was the eldest of 5 children, and all of his brothers and sisters are deceased. That's crazy to me that he's working into his 90s. It says he had been working at the shop since he was 12, filling inkwells and keeping fires going. From what I gathered, George didn't marry until he was at least 40 years old, because I'm looking at this census here and he's 40 and still single. And the lady that he married ended up having a daughter from a previous marriage, so I don't see any children from George. So at this point, there are no more family members at A&P. This 1959 article says that Ralph Burger was elected president 1 year before John died. So by 1959, he's been president for almost 10 years. So Ralph Burger dies in 1969 at the age of 79. He was president for almost 20 years. He also had no kids. A&P changes hands a few more times over the next couple decades. It has a pretty good run into the late 80s. And some of the reasons for the decline in popularity were, since the store was in operation for so long, there were employees that had been employees for a very long time, having higher wages than the store that just popped up down the street and has brand new employees working for much less. And their stores were getting old. The new stores were popping up bigger and better. Once Walmart hits the scene in the 90s, they specifically learned well from the A&P practices, and they used them bigger and better, and in a lot of ways contributed to A&P's decline. In 1992, A&P reported a loss of $189 million. They started pulling out of the southern states, and by the late 90s were only confined to a few states with about 600 stores left. This 1999 article says that A&P is closing its Richmond stores after 100 years in the area. Here's an interesting chart showing the number of stores at different points in time. I found a bunch of articles in the newspapers from all over announcing the closing of their stores. The last A&P stores were closed in 2015. In 2016, the brand name Jane Parker and the website was up for auction. The final headquarters for A&P was in New Jersey, and it also had been demolished, and a home development had replaced it. There's a few books out there, one of them called The Rise and Decline of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Now, someone has started back up the A&P Tea and Coffee Shop. I don't have much information on who or when. They don't give a lot of details on the website, but they only sell tea and coffee. So, let's look at my little lemon extract bottle. It looks like the expiration date on this is September of '74. There's still some contents in the bottle, and right now it smells like straight up alcohol at this point. There's the faintest hint of lemon, but you can almost not even detect it. Here's the bottom. This mark is an Owens mark, and if Owens marks works the same as it does in the 30s and 40s, then this would be the date. So, 1973? Now these look like they're from the 40s or 50s. I found a few cool items online with the A&P name on them. Whew! We finally made it. I really enjoyed this story. I hope you did too. I found it incredibly interesting. I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for watching.